Hello, and welcome to Working Historians, a podcast series about what historians do with their lives. I am Rob Denning, Associate Dean of Liberal Arts at Southern New Hampshire University's online history programs. Today is September 17th, which is Constitution Day in the United States, when Americans remember and celebrate the final signing of the U.S. Constitution on this day in 1787. 39 representatives, including George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Governor Morris, signed the document in the assembly room of the Pennsylvania State House after nearly 4 months of debates, arguments, negotiations, compromises, and a whole lot of sweat. The story of the Constitution didn't end on September 17th, 1787, of course, because each state then had to ratify the document, which meant more rounds of debate. The Federalist supporters of the document duked it out with anti-Federalist opponents in the newspapers and on the stump throughout the country. And then there was the formation and evolution of the Bill of Rights, which was intended to address some of the opponents' complaints while also maintaining the spirit of the original document. It was a very long, arduous process, but hopefully we can all agree that it was worth the trouble. It's almost a cliche to say that the Constitution is playing some sort of larger role in our everyday lives now than it did before, but it feels like the debates over constitutional rights have become more commonplace lately. What with mandates for face masks and vaccines in response to the coronavirus pandemic, a renewed fight over women's rights to privacy regarding abortion, challenges to the legitimacy and outcome of the 2020 presidential election, the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol that threatened to block the traditionally peaceful transition of political power, the extent of police power, racial justice, and a whole host of other issues lately. Today, I'm going to talk to a group of historians about some of these issues and, see if we can fix all the country's problems while we're at it. First, let me introduce everybody. Longtime listeners will remember Natalie Sweet, who appeared on this podcast back in 2018 and serves as the program coordinator for the Abraham Lincoln Library and Museum in Tennessee. Hi, Natalie.
Hello, Rob. Good to be with you today.
Ryan Tripp also appeared on this podcast back in 2018 when he discussed the Narragansett Ancient Constitution. Ryan also serves on the Communications Committee for the Faculty Association of California Community Colleges. Hi, Ryan. And making his first appearance on this podcast is Joel Tscherne, who teaches history at Southern New Hampshire University. Hello, Joel.
Hey, Rob.
Now, rather than focusing on specific sections of the Constitution or the ratification process, today we're going to focus on how the history of the Constitution is relevant to some of the most pressing issues of the present and of the recent past. To be specific, we're going to discuss how the Constitution has been relevant to the public health responses to disease pandemics, to the peaceful transition of political power, and the extensive history of political protests, rebellions, and insurrections in American history. So, first off, one of the most pressing issues in the U.S. today is the response to the coronavirus pandemic. There's been a lot of debate over the power of the state and federal governments to mandate masks and vaccinations. So, how has the Constitution been relevant to this discussion? I want to start with Ryan, since he has written on the topic recently. So, Ryan, what can you tell us about how the Constitution has been used to respond to disease pandemics in the past?
Well, there's been use of the free exercise clause, the free assembly clause, as well as indirect powers of Congress to, govern commerce. There's always that road with loose construction. But I think what the recent Supreme Court ruling actually cited, and I think what most historians, and this is kind of an obvious one, and I know there's many, many more, is of course the 14th Amendment, and that goes back to the 1905 Jacobson versus Massachusetts case. Okay, that occurred in 1905. Again, this is over 10 years before the H1N1, the Spanish influenza pandemic. This particular case had to do with a smallpox vaccine, although that case has been applied in not just to vaccinations, but also to, for example, masks, from the Black Triangle masks during the H1N1 pandemic to our present day masks. Also to a variety of other both federal and state orders or recommendations by the CDC to mitigate the current pandemic. So why is everybody talking about Jacobson versus Massachusetts, or at least people who talk about the Constitution and ritualize it as such?
People who know about it. Yeah.
Exactly. Why are they talking about Jacobson versus Massachusetts? Well, there's actually a couple of reasons. I think it's in United States legal history, I think Jacobson versus Massachusetts is kind of a fascinating ruling for a couple of reasons. So basically, the facts of the case are this guy named Jacobson and Massachusetts passed a law to require vaccination against smallpox. As we all know, the smallpox vaccine, or what would become the smallpox vaccine, was I guess generated, is the appropriate word, in 1796. And then there was a whole round of laws and a rise and fall of enforcement, especially through the 1813 Act by Congress. But let's take us to 1905. Jacobson doesn't want to receive the smallpox vaccine for a variety of reasons. Okay, and there's this Massachusetts law saying that he has to, or he faces a steep fine of $5. Right? He paid the $5. But him and a cohort of attorneys challenged the ruling in state court, and then the federal circuit courts, and of course the United States Supreme Court. Now his challenge, or rather his attorneys' challenge, again rested on readings of the 14th Amendment, due process, not so much equal protection, but due process, equal protection, and the various important clauses of the 14th Amendment. Now, as historians, whether or not they're legal historians or otherwise, know when you talk about the 14th Amendment during this period, it's kind of it is kind of a crucible of discord and conflict and various interpretations. And what ended up happening was that Jacobson argued that, to a certain extent, notions of liberty, and even dovetailing during this period of liberty of contract, that the state law requiring, even requisitioning vaccines, undermined his 14th Amendment rights as a citizen of the United States, and then he goes into due process and et cetera, et cetera. So the question here is there's a couple of questions as to whether the 14th Amendment even applies to this case, okay? Whether Jacobson, this state law, is violating his he called it his liberty, okay, as a citizen of the United States, and what the Supreme Court's going to do, okay? Is this constitutional law? Does this fall within both the jurisdiction of the court, and whether the vaccine falls within the jurisdiction of the state? Now, the ruling, and I'll get into historical context in like a couple seconds. The ruling, just to sort of put a cap on the story, not to ruin it for you, is that, in fact, the majority, the justice who wrote the majority ruling, and we'll get into him in a second, ruled that, in fact, no, the state does have the authority and to limit the liberties and the privileges and immunities associated with citizenship in the United States, okay, in certain regulatory cases, particularly when it comes to the public health, okay, particularly when it comes to public health. That is, this vaccine didn't apply just to Jacobson. The vaccination also applied to the community at large and the public at large. And there were, in certain cases, in fact, the majority opinion kind of goes into certain cases and where and how and why, and maybe examples. But there are certain cases where, in fact, yes, your individual liberty can be, and that liberty is socioeconomic and also having to do with your health, can be limited and regulated. I think regulated is the key word here. Now, what makes this case difficult is that the 14th Amendment, and we'll go back, and we have civil Civil War specialists, I think, on this podcast, so they can speak more to this. But during the Reconstruction period, as we all know, the 14th Amendment, via the slaughterhouse cases, the civil rights cases, and a host of other rulings, was effectively, I don't want to say reconstructed, but to a certain extent transformed by into kind of a kind of amalgam of not just, there's always protection of state commerce and interstate commerce, but it was the 14th Amendment no longer, after these cases, applied to African American freedmen. Now, technically it did, but it was expanded to the point, and this is where debates over, does loose construction and strict construction, is loose construction always, a so-called liberal doctrine? Maybe, maybe not. But it wasn't directed, the 14th Amendment wasn't directed anymore at its, its initial, I'm not going to say original intentions, but initial intentions for protecting African American freedmen and women and providing them protection that they are due as citizens of the United States, particularly when it comes to equal protection of the laws being applied equally, and also procedurally through due process, okay? So this, and since the 14th Amendment is constructed to not apply to them, that's where we get the advent of state Jim Crow laws, through these rulings and the federal government not being able to use the 14th Amendment for what it was intended to do, state Jim Crow laws are easier to pass in the late 19th century. So this takes us up to Jacobson versus Massachusetts, and Jacobson is using the 14th Amendment to argue that this state law, a la a state Jim Crow law, is violating his 14th Amendment. And he's not necessarily self-identifying as an African American freedman, but that's essentially what he's doing. He's using kind of a parallel argument, okay, that in fact the 14th Amendment should and would protect him from state incursions in due process and his liberties as a citizen of the United States. All right? So it's not surprising that the majority opinion on this, who kind of overrode this and said, no, in fact, there is state police power, okay, is in fact, and the federal, there's limits to this kind of liberties, but also limits to what the federal jurisdiction versus state jurisdiction can do. Not surprisingly, if you think in dialectical and legal terms, was Marshall Harlan. If any of you are familiar with Marshall Harlan, he wrote one of the, he's famous for writing a major dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson, which legitimated right, separate but equal. He dissented against this, okay? So to a certain extent, Harlan's backing up from his previous dissent and saying, well, the 14th Amendment does have certain limitations, but if you read the Jacobson ruling, he also it's in a word, it's not just sophisticated, but nuanced insofar that he says, no, the federal government and the 14th Amendment should and could, in a lot of cases, does have jurisdiction to protect individual citizens. And he is emphatic about that. Okay, he is very, very emphatic about that. But there are certain exceptions, particularly when it comes to individual liberties versus the public health or interfacing with the public health that states, and if it's through a state law, the state is, if the state's regulating that, then the state should and would have that kind of jurisdiction. Okay, so it seemingly contradicted some of his earlier arguments when it came to African American freedmen, that he makes an all-out effort in that majority ruling, and it's most likely one of the reasons he wanted to write the majority ruling, and he was appointed, of course. That he didn't want this to be used, this ruling to be used in dialectical fashion to argue against or for state Jim Crow laws. He really wanted to show that, in fact, in certain cases, it's acceptable and even advised that state laws that protect the public health should move forward. All right. So that's why the Supreme Court is well, not why, but one of the reasons many superior courts and federal circuit courts in the U.S. Supreme Court often cite Jacobson versus Massachusetts in this regard. So again, though, that's the 14th Amendment. There's other clauses that I've read pretty recently that have been bandied about, although, you know, there's federal laws about the executive having the power to protect and to limit the transmission of communicable diseases, particularly when it comes to foreign countries and when it comes to us interfacing with foreign countries. There's also the spending and commerce clauses that have to do with more interstate commerce. And if you can, you know, conceptualize masks, for example, especially if they're on sale as commodities, then that may come under congressional jurisdiction, particularly under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. You know, and then there's also been, like I said at the top of this, there's also been citations to the Free Exercise Clause and the Free Assembly Clause, and of course the First Amendment of the Constitution. But those have not been, again, as rigorous and as frequently cited as the 14th Amendment and Jacobson versus Massachusetts in 1905.
Yeah, and that's a fascinating history. The 14th Amendment is I wrote my MA thesis on the 14th Amendment, and so it's fascinating because the public health aspect of it never came up in my research, but it is really interesting to see this that Jacobson decision happening within the context of it's only what 20 years ish after the slaughterhouse cases, and you see it feels like, and then of course Plessy versus Ferguson, it does feel like it's a very different interpretation of the 14th Amendment than those other decisions have made. So it's really interesting to think that Harlan was kind of behind that. I hadn't really thought about that aspect of it before. That's really interesting.
And it's intersecting with the Progressive era too, obviously.
The 14th Amendment has had such an interesting history and just playing into the area of health and life, and a lot of that has to do really with that due process clause that appears in Section 1. I think sometimes when we think about the 14th Amendment, you know, we think a lot about that first line, the very first line of the 14th Amendment that says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States, or, you know, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, they're citizens of the United States. And that, I think, is where, you know, a general audience, that may be their familiarity with the 14th Amendment, that might end there. But there's 5 whole sections, and if you continue reading on, in Section 1, the due process clause is there, and that applies to what Ryan's been talking about, that nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process. And that's not only come up in the field of talking about vaccinations, masks, all that. It's come up again in 1997 when talking about right to die laws or death with dignity. And that came up in Washington versus Glucksberg, which was a challenge against Washington State's ban on assisted suicide. And they again go back to that due process clause again to argue that assisted suicide and the, in effect, right to die is a liberty interest. So it's interesting to see the way that the 14th Amendment has had this expanded role in helping us think about vaccine mandates, or even something that we might connect with the opposite end of dying with dignity.
Yeah, and so with the Supreme Court cases and the various interpretations of the 14th Amendment in place, so the big precedent that people have been talking about when it comes to COVID-19, of course, is the Spanish flu in the wake of World War I in the 19-teens. And so do we have a sense of, you know, what were the precedents that were established during that period that are kind of at play today? What are the lessons that we learned from that, the Spanish flu era?
Well, one of the first things I can mention related to that, for one thing, the Spanish flu pretty much died off on its own. Obviously, there never was a vaccine at the time. It's just one of those things where suddenly it was gone. How it happened, I'm not sure myself. I haven't studied the Spanish flu as closely, obviously. However, we know that there were anti-maskers then. They did organize. It was the same concepts of some of the things that we're running into now. The difference now, and this is where where you get away from the comparison to the Spanish flu, is that we do have vaccines that have been scientifically shown to have very good success against COVID-19, excuse me. So the question becomes, how is it different? Where are we supposed, back in 1918, 19, there was not an ability to do that. So the question is, most people who want vaccines or are happy that there's a vaccine now believe it's the only way it will completely end is to have a vaccine, is for people to take the vaccine, although the anti-vaccine people and others similar have talked about the concept of herd immunity a lot, which is that enough people get it that eventually it'll disappear on its own. The negative in this case so far has been the variants, which seem to be coming out a lot. So the question is, can you compare the two? 100%, we don't, I know there was a lot of hope that COVID would disappear on its own eventually, but of course it hasn't. And lately, especially in some areas of the country, and mine's one of them, the numbers continue to go high to the extent that we are now above what they were at the beginning. So 1918 maybe reached an end on its own, but the current one and the concern obviously is going to be continuing. How do we deal with a part of the population who believe that they have the right or the ability to refuse either a vaccine or even the protections that have been mandated in many states, or at least suggested by public health officials?
So in terms of the Spanish influenza, I agree with Joel and all his comments that during actually the Spanish influenza, or the apogee of it, at least from 1918 to 1919, this was more a state and local. It was subject to state and local jurisdiction. One thing that's hampering it becoming a federal constitutional issue, that's not to say there weren't. There was, of course, cases challenging its constitutionality, and then also print cultures of that, was the fact of the matter is, and it really, when you study the H1N1 influenza pandemic, you really run into, it's a story both of that, and then that's also related to World War I and the Wilson administration's handling of World War I, particularly after the preparedness movement, as well as the issues going into 1918 and going into the first Red Scare regarding, and it set the tone for the 20s, right? The entwinement of civil liberties and what amounts to this celebration of commerce, celebration of capital. And, we see and entwining the two. And I think you see a lot of, there's definitely a strong deterrence against discourse, political discourse, and legal discussions over anything that would have to do with critiquing the way the federal government and state governments are handling World War I, right? It isn't just the Wilson administration either. There's state laws that are during World War I that are mandating that we you change the name of German foods to more U.S. Nomenclature or American English nomenclature, and so in terms of that, that's really limiting. There's not these outspoken arguments going on as to whether or not. There are, but it's definitely hampering it becoming a very hardcore legal issue where you see several Supreme Court cases arising from it. On the other hand, that doesn't necessarily preclude state and local, state and local journalists, for example, pundits and political commentators from debating the constitutionality of it. I mean, it's in the print cultures, throughout the 1918 to 1919 pandemic, or at least as I saw it. I mean, and then it goes beyond that. I mean, people like John Dewey advances his his effective freedom and his negative freedom. He goes into the theoretical underpinnings of it and discusses it, and then suggests just in that context tries to push forward new ways to envision a political economy when it comes to the public health and the reasons for the public health versus commerce. I mean, Dewey gets into this he does a series of lectures at Stanford University and at UC Berkeley in California, where he really gets into how state requirements for masks, right, can help usher in a new formulation of U.S. And California political economy premised on both negative freedom, what he calls negative freedom, and effective freedom, or some of the journalists call positive negative liberty. So I mean, I do think, I guess my point here is that I think studying the constitutionality of state and federal mask mandates, as well as a host of other precautions that were taken, and some of them are some that we take today weren't taken then, like social distancing and masks, I would say, is that it needs to be tied, put in the context, I think, of World War I and the Wilson administrations, as well as state legislatures handling of World War I and U.S. society. And just one thing to note too, that that what Joel said is absolutely correct. That I don't know if it quite took care of itself, but there wasn't any hardcore successful vaccine during the apogee of the pandemic, the 1918-19 pandemic. There was, of course, the Leary vaccine, which was shown to be, I'm not going to say it was bunk, but there was the Leary vaccine that a lot of people thought was working and kind of tapered off and didn't really work. But if you really study the 1918-1919 period, there's a lot of focus on the Leary vaccine somehow working and then not.
One of the big issues, of course, that's been happening in the United States over the last year or so during this pandemic, to move on to kind of our second topic here, is the fact that in the middle of this pandemic, we went into a presidential election that turned out to be a very dramatic, to put it mildly, presidential election, where the result of the election was not accepted by the losing candidate, Donald Trump, who believed that there was some sort of fraud or chicanery or some sort of problem, corruption, fraud within the election system that resulted in his electoral loss. And so I just wondered if we could talk a little bit about this concept of a peaceful transition of political power, because we in the United States have kind of taken that for granted. And so I'm wondering what you all think about what does the Constitution have to say about the actual transition of political power? What does it? I know that we've built a tradition of a peaceful transition of power, but where does that tradition come from? What does the Constitution have to say about the transition of power, and how has it evolved over time? And then we'll talk a little bit about efforts to obstruct the peaceful transitions in our next topic. But for now, let's focus on the peaceful transition part of it. Where does that come from?
The interesting thing is there is very little written in the original document as far as the quote unquote transition of power. Obviously, there are certain aspects that are written in there in the original document, and the assumption is that Congress would continue to add to that. In fact, a lot of the Constitution assumes that will happen. In fact, the first time there was a non-elected person being considered for president, and I say considered, it was when William Henry Harrison was president for all of 30 days, and he was the first president to die in office. John Tyler was his vice president, and at that point, there was no set, obviously there was no precedent as to what would happen next. John Tyler basically believed that he was now president, that the Constitution, the way it was written, the way he read it, was that he became president. Um, of course, that was not something that was totally agreed upon. It was argued quite a bit. There were some issues related to, okay, would people agree with that? Well, Tyler, obviously there were some, and it was political. I mean, obviously we were talking, his political opponents weren't happy with him with doing that, believing that there was nothing in the Constitution that specified that the vice president becomes president. The assumption among many would be that he would become an acting president until another president could be elected. But as we've said, there's nothing in the original Constitution related to that. But over time and reasonably quickly, Tyler was able to get Congress to not the question was, would Congress pass something or disagree in some way, and it didn't happen. It was definitely argued about quite a bit. The congressional transcripts from the time show it mentioned, but it actually died off reasonably quickly, at least as far as whether he was president or not. And of course, from that point forward, that became the regular aspect of how a president was replaced if he died. Of course, the Constitution finally gets into it after John Kennedy is assassinated, where the Constitution finally had a actual amendment that specified what happened if a president dies, including obviously the vice president becoming president, but also the ability to replace the vice president who now became president with a replacement. And that was put in partly because when you look at the information, by 1963, a lot of people weren't the previous president who died in office was Roosevelt in 1945. So this was 20 years later, and before that, you have to go all the way back to McKinley. So there were long periods of time where people just didn't think about this. But finally, after the 1963 death of Kennedy, Congress put together an amendment that not only did it give the specifics of what happens when a president dies and is definitely replaced by the vice president, and the fact that you can then now the new president can then appoint with Senate approval or with Congress approval a replacement. And in fact, the first time that happened would have been when Spiro Agnew resigned because of a criminal case going on under Nixon. So he was replaced by Gerald Ford, who then replaced him when he became president, then nominated Nelson Rockefeller to be his vice president. The other thing that the amendment added after Kennedy's death was how to handle a situation where the president might not be able to perform his or her duties. And that was something that had always been an issue. And if you go back to the end of Woodrow Wilson's term, or second term, when he had a stroke and basically generally believed that was not really able to carry on the duties. And in fact, there were issues where, for example, was his wife doing much of the work, or how was this being handled? And in the modern day, there's just no way in the world I would think that a president could hide that. But at that point, it was something that it was suspected, but there was no way to actually prove it. So one of the other things that happened out of the 25th Amendment was to add the ability to have the president step away for a period of time if necessary, or be replaced using mental or physical issues. So while the Constitution original document didn't really go into real detail, it became precedent. That's one of the things they talk about. That what's talked about regularly is George Washington willingness to, once his terms are up, and there was no term limits at the time, he could have run a third time, and then he left. And since then, it's generally speaking, each president, when they've lost, have stepped down and moved on. So and then it's finally been codified, or at least put in the Constitution, and Congress has then passed some laws to have everything work the way it's supposed to. But so finally, the Constitution caught up with the precedent after John Kennedy's death.
Yeah, and so much of what we see changing in the Constitution with the later amendments too, a lot of what we think about when we think about presidents coming into the office is largely built and for a long time follows tradition. A lot of that coming and beginning with George Washington and the very earliest presidents. As was just discussed, Washington has his 2 terms and he decides it's best to then step aside and let others begin to take on that mantle of leadership. And we don't see constitutional laws changing in regards to term limits for presidents until after World War II and after Franklin Delano Roosevelt's death, who had multiple terms, whose terms spun throughout the Great Depression and through World War II. And then we see that changing because really up until the point of Roosevelt, there had never really been an instance where we had a president with more than 1 to 2 terms. So sometimes what begins as tradition, when something goes up against it that challenges that traditional thought or thought, well, this is the way we've always done it, so surely we'll keep on doing it. When that's challenged, there begins to be discussions about constitutionally addressing that. So, for example, too, the things we think about today, or perhaps that we thought about until the prior point about, well, a president welcomes the incoming president, their wife or whoever is serving as hostess in the White House, that designated role as First Lady. She'll then show the next lady, she'll give her a tour the day before and show her the running of the household. That didn't transpire with our latest election. That had been always something that had been done, even during perhaps one of the most controversial or at least politically fraught elections prior to this time. If we're looking at 1860 to 1861, when James Buchanan transitions over to Abraham Lincoln, who with his election has seen states secede from the Union in response. Buchanan welcomes Lincoln into the White House. His niece welcomes Mary Lincoln in and shows her the running of the household. They go over the accounts, and these were 2 men who did not agree with each other. They did not like with each other. Famously, later Lincoln would supposedly say that when Mary Lincoln was fussing at him for feeding the tabby cats a little bit of food off of the White House silverware, he said, if it's good enough for Buchanan, it's good enough for Tabby. There's no love lost here. But that transition, that tradition lived on. But just as we see with Roosevelt after he has passed on, and you begin to see parties discussing, should there be term limits? There could be questions of, do there need to be greater protections? Or does there need to be something formalized within the Constitution to address how things are supposed to occur?
I also wanted to add, too, not to underestimate the influence of cultural representations of violence and conjectures about, what so-and-so happened, so-and-so state, or against whatever state assembly, right? And how this could happen to, in the central or federal government. I mean, certainly the transition from the Annapolis Convention with revising the Articles of Confederation to framing a new federal constitution and the plans thereof, in part, I mean, this is kind of going back to like sixth grade social studies, but what partly expedited that, pushed that along was Shays' Rebellion and veterans' grievances, particularly when it came to their salaries and then land leases, and or what they were due. And so that that particularly was promoted as kind of an attack that shook, or it was advanced as such, that shook the United States to the core. And it's been, I think, correctly cited as again an expediting factor for the shift to a federal constitution rather than just revising the Articles of Confederation. But beyond that too, there's been acts of violence even within Congress. Both by people that were elected and were seated there, and some that weren't. I think there's the historian Joanne Freeman, in a kind of a prescient way, wrote a couple years ago, wrote a book, The Field of Blood, about violence in Congress and the buildup to the Civil War, which Natalie already pretty astutely addressed. But I do want to say too, that it's not only cultural representations, but also keep in mind too that even individual acts of violence, both how they're represented, but also their consequences, and varieties of violence. It's important to note that. I mean, like the classic example of the Sumner caning, right? The Charles Prescott Brooks caning Charles Sumner, okay, over issues having to do with the Civil War and abolitionism, etc. I mean, that was represented not just in news stories, but also visual culture for people's reaching for varieties of literacy, and that definitely impacted, I think, what became the discord that resulted in Civil War. I mean, Sumner, and it's not just cultural representations too. I mean, I think Sumner himself was, I think he eventually died, or he started losing his memory from that particular beating over the head. I mean, we talk about it, but it was actually a pretty severe beating he took in his head. So both, again, cultural representations of violence on the Capitol and what that portends could greatly influence U.S. Political culture, as well as the consequences of individual acts of violence by people that are supposed to be there and people not supposed to be there.
And I would agree and back that up with Joel too. Just to throw in, we think of Sumner today, and he made a great recommendation for Joanne Freeman's book, Field of Blood. It's a great look at political violence in the period up to the Civil War. But Sumner is just the most famous case of political violence that we remember and teach about today. There are other instances also revolving around the subject of slavery in the lead up to the Civil War. We can look at John Potter from Wisconsin. He is nearly called into a duel with another Southerner over their discussion, and Potter famously calls for the use of Bowie knives during the night, and during the fight, and they are so at odds with each other over this, and the public spectacle, the idea of these congressmen dueling, which is illegal in Washington, D.C., and then the areas outside of it as well. It so takes the public imagination that when the 1860 Republican convention, the nominating convention, occurs, that supporters of Potter who want to throw his name into the ring, he didn't really have a chance, they bring out a 6-foot Bowie knife that they've recreated to mark the moment. It was well enough known and would be recognized at the convention. So it was very much visually a part of the culture. It's very much visually a part of Lincoln's inauguration too. When he actually takes office, it's known that there are assassination attempts. One is foiled in Baltimore before he arrives in the Capitol. And if you look at accounts of the city at that time, soldiers are already starting to be in the city, and according to one individual who was writing in his journal at the time, living in Washington, D.C., he's noting that individuals within the audience, whereas they might not always carry weapons with them before, people were carrying pistols with them to be in action. So all of that that's occurring before is playing out within the public.
And then the other one that kind of along those lines that I've always been interested in is the duel that was fought between the U.S. Senator David Broderick from California and David Terry, who was the former Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, and they fought a duel in 1859, and the duel had come from they used to be friends, but they had diverged over the issue of slavery to the point where they started shooting at each other one day, and the Senator David Broderick ended up dying in that duel. So yeah, there's violence happening, and that was in California, so it's happening literally across the country, but it's also happening within Congress, but out in the rest of the country also.
This is a personal plug, but they're like 4 minutes away. There's from where I'm sitting right now. There's a restaurant called Broderick's, and it tells that entire story on the wall of when you enter the restaurant.
Oh, very cool.
The whole story of all the duel, and supposedly the certain food was Broderick's favorite food in this particular restaurant.
That's very cool. But I'm also wondering, when it comes to talking about the peaceful transition of power, going back to that idea, is it too much to say, and this is something that I haven't really done any kind of serious research on, and so I may be just kind of making this up, and who knows, but I'm curious what you all think about this idea that the Constitution itself, yes, there's the later amendments that codified when the vice president becomes president and all of that, but I'm wondering, the original conception of the Constitution, the selection of the president, depended on who got the most electoral votes, but then the person that got the second most electoral votes became the vice president, which usually means that you're going to have a president from one party and a vice president from the other party. And then usually, as we saw during the early administrations, the Washington years, the Adams years, and a little bit into the Jefferson years, you start to see the vice presidential candidate, or the vice president, sorry, not candidate, but the actual vice president, who would set about to kind of undermine the policies and the power of the president, because whoever was in the presidency was of the opposite political party. And so I'm wondering, kind of looking at it from that perspective, I wonder do you guys think there's anything to this idea that the original Constitution was actually kind of designed to create a little bit of political tension? I'm sure they wouldn't want violence. They wouldn't want, David Broderick dying from a gunshot wound or, anything like that. But I'm wondering if there's anything to the idea that there actually was built into the system a little bit of political tension that we actually we as the United States kind of outgrew over time, and then eventually kind of wiped away from the Constitution with things like the 12th Amendment and later on the 26th Amendment. I'm forgetting which amendment it was in the wake of JFK's death. But do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Well, part of what I tend to read from Washington and some of the other participants is, I believe if we're going to be supposing that the idea was that there would, the lack of parties, really this was not a political party situation when the Constitution was first passed. We don't really get a true political party issue until Thomas Jefferson, the Jefferson-Adams election. And of course, we know that Washington spoke against political factions, whether it was the idea that they thought, well, we're, the men who are writing this document and those that will continue on in the new government are quote unquote above that. Maybe they didn't really believe that, but they said it a lot. They felt that parties were not going to be an issue. So in this particular case, you're right. The second place voter, the person who got the second most votes became vice president. And there is obviously, the person who did not win is not necessarily, even if they're in the same party, there is questions related to can the president and vice president get along? And I think it doesn't take long to prove that it was going to be a bigger issue And it's not very long after the first few terms, the first few presidents, that law changed, or that part of the Constitution was amended to take away that situation, whether it was purely political. Was it a political reason? Because by that point, the parties were in existence, or because it didn't work or wasn't working. Is I'm not sure myself.
I I would put in though too that really uh, the position of Vice President of the United States was originally much more toothless than we imagine it to be today. And a lot of that has to do with the vice presidents who've been in the position of power since the tenure of the second George Bush, that we see a different role for vice presidents and their activity within that position. John Adams, uh, during his tenure, is really kind of put out that he's largely excluded from what, or as he sees being excluded from being really a part of the people who make things happen in while he is in the position. And so it's really when we get to the 12th Amendment and we look more at the vice president coming from the same party or being selected to be with the vice president instead of being the second runner-up. I'm not certain that they really saw the issue that the second runner-up being vice president was a problem, just because they saw it as, you know, a much more limited role than we tend to assign the position today. Of course, I am not as strong on my 12th Amendment understanding or of the vice president, but it would seem to point that just based on Adams' experience and our much different view of the vice president today, that could be the case.
I think certainly too, to add on this, I mean, faction isn't necessarily party isn't necessarily faction, but I think during the ratification debates, James Madison wrote what would become Federalist 10, and I think more the focus of that particular argument had to do with faction, and I think I'm not sure the Constitution or even the Virginia Plan as proposed was full on embracing partisanship or even kind of a factional identity, but certainly I think James Madison sort of alludes to the fact that it's almost, I'm not going to say inevitable, but he definitely, factions are quite frequent in the history of political systems, and I think he focuses on controlling the effects, right, with multiple candidates and representation of interest, and I think, and then how the compromise is the name of the game, and issues like that. And so I think he's sort of focused on accepting factions. Again, parties aren't necessarily factions. Factions aren't necessarily parties. But I think he seemed to be at least accepting of the fact that there would be some sort of factionalism going on, and then focusing on its consequences and both controlling and harnessing them is sort of his central argument. Again, that's also related to apportionment of representation of population and the Three-Fifths Compromise and all that. I also wanted to note too that in terms of the history of party, I mean, certainly there's a lot of influences in the American Revolution, as we know, from country party authors. How those influences played out and why they played out, it's always subject to historiographical debate. But British histories of party, I finished reading recently a book published by Cambridge University Press called The Persistence of Party in British political and intellectual culture, and it was very compelling, showing that parties, certain authors and pundits really focused on parties as being crucial to a political system, could undo the political system, but also were very important to understanding political systems and could in some cases advance with multiple causes. And so the title of the book is The Persistence of Party. And again, that book also contains James Madison, and that's kind of the go-to figure. And I think James Madison is cited as accepting the presence of parties in polities through time.
That's really good, and I appreciate all of your insights there. I forget where the question about the original president versus vice president, I forget where that came up as originally. I think it might have been a discussion with students in one of my classes, and I've always just been kind of curious about that. Like I said, I haven't done any research on it, so certainly not about to publish a book on it or anything. But this was a really interesting conversation that kind of informed a lot of my thoughts on that. So that's really great. Thank you for that. So let's wrap up here today by talking a little bit about the efforts to prevent the peaceful transition of power. We've actually already talked about a bunch of that here, and obviously the most obvious, before putting aside the January 6th insurrection, as it's been called in the United States this year in 2021. Of course, the previous example was the Civil War, which was, of course, the most dramatic instance of trying to prevent the peaceful transition of power. And so I'm wondering, are there any other examples from American history that we could point to of efforts to try to stop that, the peaceful transition of power? And how have we kind of moved on from that as a nation? How have we addressed the desire to block the transition of power? And in many ways, I suppose this really gets to kind of the core of American democracy, is that democracy only works if both sides agree to abide by the results of an election. But what other instances have we seen in American history that might be in some way comparable to the January 6th insurrection?
Well, I still think we have to kind of go to 1860 to 1861. So maybe we should dive into that one a little deeper.
Let's do it.
Yeah. So if we're looking at the election of Abraham Lincoln, there's a few different things we have to know in preview before we discuss it. And one, it doesn't end up being your typical two candidates from two different parties running for the presidency in 1860. It will be Abraham Lincoln for the newly formed Republican Party, but you also have a split in the Democratic Party and resulting in two candidates, and you also have the creation of an entirely new party called the Constitutional Union Party with John Bell of Tennessee being its candidate. So this is really a four-horse race, and all the candidates will pull votes from all the areas, all different areas. No one goes home without a state's electoral votes. Even John Bell has a few. So what we see with Abraham Lincoln as an added point is that if we're talking about, I don't know if we want to talk about obstruction or, obstruction of voting or what have you, but Lincoln's name is purposely left off of ballots in many southern states. So he's not even appearing as a candidate in many cases. But he still wins the election of 1860, and that then starts this process of secession of states from the Union. We see South Carolina in December, and then in January we see Mississippi and Florida and Alabama. Georgia will be the last right before we get to the point where Lincoln will begin, I guess Louisiana too, before Lincoln begins his journey towards Washington, D.C. to be inaugurated as president in 1861. And there was a great deal of anxiety within the American public at that time. Lincoln was seen, even though he was a moderate Republican candidate and would publicly say that he, did not advocate. He knew that the Constitution did not allow him to affect slavery within the slaveholding states. He did not believe it allowing that. He did not have plans to interfere with that. He did, however, privately and firmly say, he wanted to stop the expansion of slavery within Western territories. And the Southern public had become familiar with Abraham Lincoln, in part because they had followed the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858. That's what really gives Lincoln national rise. And Lincoln's opponent, Stephen Douglas, will be one of those candidates for whom the Democratic Party, when it breaks, Douglas will be one of the men who runs against Lincoln once again. Ironically, they're both from Springfield. They've also probably both courted Mary Todd, who's Lincoln's eventual wife at the same time. Lincoln went out, obviously. But Lincoln is also very aware that the secession of the states is tied to his position on slavery. They have followed the Lincoln-Douglas debates. They've discovered that they really don't like what he has to say concerning slavery, because that is the topic of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. But Lincoln helps to publicize that position even further following the Lincoln-Douglas debates, because he has the debates publicly printed and bound and sold as copies. And leading up to 1860, he goes on a somewhat of a national tour. He doesn't really travel into the South to give speeches, but he does make it to the Northeast. He travels in parts west, and he begins talking to crowds. And when he's coming to Washington, D.C. after his election, he has stayed purposely quiet, trying not to arouse anger. James Buchanan, as I noted in a previous section, he's going to do those traditional things that presidents have traditionally done, taking the ride with the incoming president to the inaugural ceremonies, but he really doesn't do anything to halt the oncoming Civil War, because that is what is now is happening. He is not going to deal with the secession crisis. He is going to leave that to Lincoln and his incoming administration to solve. And the streets in Washington, D.C. are quite concerned. Washington, D.C. will remain in federal hands throughout the war, but it is a divided city. There are a great deal of people with Southern and what will eventually be Confederate loyalties in that city, and there's a great deal of people with loyalties towards the United States as well. On his way to be inaugurated, Lincoln is being very careful not to give very large public speeches or public statements that will go out into the press. He does make some addressing of crowds along the way. For example, he will stop in Philadelphia at Independence Hall, and he gives a speech in which he says he's never had any thought that didn't spring from the Declaration of Independence. He always centers that at the center of his political thought. And there continues to be growing tension, and while he's on his way, he receives information that a plot has been uncovered in Baltimore to assassinate him. Up until that point in time in history, no one has ever assassinated a president in United States history, and it is foiled in part because of the services of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which at that time was for hire and had been contracted to help foil any attempts, because there was public knowledge that there was growing sentiment that it could go into physical violence. So there were lots of soldiers in the Capitol at the 1861 inauguration. Lincoln has formed an inaugural address that attempts to make amends, saying, basically, we're not enemies, we're friends, you can come back in, it's not too late, but also being very firm in character that should things progress, that he will stand forcefully behind the preservation of the United States. And individuals who were there watching the address were fearful that day. There were fears, legitimately, that violence would break out in the streets. There were a great deal of concerns that there might be hidden enemies with Confederate sympathies who would attack. That later leads to a select committee within Washington, D.C., led by the very John Potter that I mentioned before, too. He of Bowie knife fame. He'll lead that select committee to try to ferret out people who are working in the federal government who have Confederate sympathies and loyalties. So it is a divided town. people are on edge. There is cannon fire that occurs during the inauguration, and it makes people jump, not just because of the noise, because they're truly fearful that violence is going to follow. But the traditions of the day went out in this instance. Buchanan rides with Lincoln to the inauguration. Lincoln gives his speech. They have the typical balls that follow a presidential inauguration. And all continues on until we eventually get to the point of Fort Sumter.
I did want to note too that I'm not sure if there's been in terms of exactly like the direct attack on the Capitol. I mean, say for Natalie's erudite assessment of the Civil War. I mean, we have the Grant and Hayes Compromise of 1877 that involves troop withdrawal to a certain extent. I mean, I could tell you that there's been presidents that haven't. One president hasn't. The president-elect hasn't liked the lame duck president. I mean, such as the case with FDR and Hoover, right? And Herbert Hoover, right? FDR was not really that into Hoover and engaged in several acts that made it clear that he wanted Hoover to go away. I mean, there's also been, this is more electoral and settled in the court system, but there was still, I think, protests. Was the 2000 election and the 2000-2001 transition from Bill Clinton to George Bush and the Supreme Court ruling on the Florida vote tallies. That certainly, in recent memory, was a disputed election. But again, that was handled within the court system, although there were protests and et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think it didn't result in a full-on attack on the Capitol.
I think the fact that Gore was willing to accept it is what obviously diffused that situation. Had Gore chosen to be more to disagree in some way, there may have been bigger issues in 2000. But in this particular case, and he did a speech and everything in which he said he disagreed with the results, but those were the results. And that's certainly different from what happened in 1860, and even to an extent what happened in 2020, where one candidate chose to indicate that there were fraud in the election. Was even saying it before the election even happened. So he laid the groundwork to use that argument. Unfortunately, and this goes back to our discussion about the pandemic. The pandemic got politicized, as far as I see, right at the beginning, and unfortunately, that also was an issue with the election, where right from the beginning there was fears of one candidate not accepting the results, and that's turned out to be the case. It was clear that the country made it through the transition. It was tough, and I will be honest. I was one of those folks who was considerably worried until January 20th, and would it actually happen? And thankfully it did, although what really would have happened, no one really knows. I mean, there's starting to be more and more material coming out about what was going on, but I think we have to be careful with that. We as historians don't, talk about current events as being historical, because there's just so much information we don't know. And there's a lot of folks coming out with books and stuff, but we haven't had a chance to really identify or look at them as anything related to history. One of the things I wanted to mention about 1860 related to the beginnings of the Civil War, that there was an actual, at the time South Carolina seceded from the Union, which was in December, so barely a month after the election, they seceded. However, they'd been talking about it ahead of time. This was not some big surprise that they went. They had said that Lincoln's election was going to be an issue, and so it's not completely surprising from the period to know that that's not that the fact that they left wasn't a surprise. But what was also going on during that period is that the various what would become Confederate states, starting with South Carolina, were sending what they called commissioners from their state to other states to try to convince other states to also secede. They would bring information and details and reasoning from why one state chose to secede. There's a great, interesting book by Charles Dew called Apostles of Disunion, which I think really lays this out just to show that whether you could consider that to be sedition in any way, shape, or form is open to question. But there's no question that there was actual planning and or work being done behind the scenes, so to speak, to develop and to expand the Confederacy, what would become the Confederacy, even before Lincoln took office.
Yeah, and I think based on what you guys have been saying here, that I think the difference with 2020, of course, seems to be that there actually is a candidate who's doing this openly. You were talking about how you've got the commissioners going out and kind of making arrangements with other states, but that's all happening in secret. That's not happening right out in public. 2020, of course, is different. The 2021 insurrection is different because there is, there is kind of focused around one candidate in the way it seems to have played out anyway. And again, Joel makes an excellent point that, of course, we can't speak too much about January 6th yet as historians because it's so recent. But the kind of in some ways, I guess perhaps the obvious difference, of course, is that you've got all of the hopes and dreams of the part of the group of people that are trying to obstruct the election are personified in one person. It's not really in a cause so much like it was back in 1860. In 1860, it was kind of this movement amongst a whole lot of different politicians. Really, in 2021, it was kind of focused around one person, which I think is the main difference here. And who knows, as we uncover more information as time goes on, maybe, who knows, our current conception of January 6th could be completely wrong, and who knows what will change by then. But that, at least in the short term, seems to be one of the differences here, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think Joel also makes a point too that not just a lame duck president, but it could also be the incoming president. Not so much accepting, but adhering to various legal processes and electoral tallies and decision making that we usually are organizing principles for our political system, and then continuing forward that that usually mitigates any potential of something, along the lines of what happened with the transition from Trump to Biden.
And unfortunately, this is one of those examples that we continually were saying, particularly in this last year, but sometimes over the last 4 years, to be frank about it, was we are seeing things that we've never seen before. And although we're trying to look at the past to try to say, okay, have we seen things? And clearly 1860 is still worse than anything else that we've ever seen. 1876 with the end of Reconstruction, that particular decision over that contested election was bad, but and as bad as January 6th was or likely was, it still isn't the same as 1860, which when we talk to people who aren't historians, or when we hear people who aren't historians, they tend to focus on present and not really know the specifics, which of course is one of the reasons we're doing this in the first place, is to try to look back and say, okay, can we really say is there something that was worse? Yes. Could it have been a little better? Yes. But the bottom line is that this last year or so, in many ways, and if you go back into the pandemic, is things that we've never seen before.
Now, what is so interesting about this current moment too, and what struck me on January 6th, because I did watch the floor of Congress following that, was how often the members of both parties then called upon the words of Abraham Lincoln, either in often out of context, but still, but they called upon those words of Lincoln. There was an awareness that we had somehow reached a moment that tied us to another moment of great distress just by the fact that both sides at that time were calling on the memory of the 16th president.
That's right. I had forgotten about that. That's interesting. I'm glad you brought that up. So I think really this demonstrates, of course, that historians, I think we should all get together in about 150 years, and the four of us can discuss the January 6th insurrection in a little bit more context, a little more kind of the longer scope of history. And until then, I think this is probably a good time to bring this to an end. We've been talking for about an hour and a half now, and this is a really great conversation. I think we can probably all go for the rest of the week if we wanted to. But I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you all for joining me here today.
Thanks, Rob, for having us, or me.
Thanks, Rob.
It's been great talking with you all.
And thank you all for joining us today. This episode appears on the Working Historians podcast feed, and you can subscribe to that feed on any podcast app, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Lyceum, SoundCloud, Podbean, or whatever else you prefer. That way you won't miss any episodes, and you'll continue to hear about all the other cool stuff that historians do with their lives. If you have any questions or comments for this or any other of our podcasts, please send us a message to workinghistorians@gmail.com or through our Twitter feed at WorkHistorians. For Natalie Sweet, Ryan Tripp, and Joel Tscherne, I'm Rob Denning. Happy Constitution Day, everybody. Go party like it's 1787.